So my day job is in IT, and when a machine gets a virus or something breaks, it's usually way easier to just reinstall the operating system from a known good state than it is to bother troubleshooting it. You'll burn hours trying to get a virus out. You may not succeed. So take 10 minutes, throw Windows back on there. But the problem with that is it takes time to put your software, like say Office, or if they've got CAD utilities or whatever it is, your antivirus, all your updates and patches, that can take you many, many hours. So what you can do is take a sort of a snapshot of a machine and then roll it back to that sort of like a save point in the game, if you will. So you can just take 10 minutes or 15 minutes and just blast all that data right back on that hard drive so it's back to a known good state, and then you can go from there. There's a couple of products. There's in the real world one by Norton called Ghost. Microsoft has their own. They're not cheap, and they're also challenging to run as well. So generally though, it's IT people running it. So I run this in my house, but that's because all my friends and family hand me computers to fix on a regular basis. So instead of reaching for CDs, I can just plug it into my network and go. So I'll just give you a brief demo here. This is just pretending to be a server running the actual fog installation. All the details are on the website, and we can do a more detailed demo or installation demo later on. So I'm going to pretend to turn on another computer. So this is going to be like a laptop or something else on the network. And so now it's connecting to the network, and now it's actually booting this menu live off of the network. There's no CDs in the machine. Maybe if we do a more in-depth one, I can bring another laptop in and actually have a separate laptop and go through this menu. So one other handy thing is when we, before we recycle hardware, we want to make sure that there's no data left on the hard drive. So we'll use a package called DBAN, which stands for Derek's Boot and Nuke, which is basically just a way of wiping out a hard drive so there's no way to recover any data from it.
Does it actually physically write zeros all over it?
Actually, what it does is it writes, there's many different options, but there's one where the default option, it writes ones, zeros, then random, and it does that pattern either 3 or a number of times. Yeah.
Enough times that they can never get it back.
It's DoD standards.
Well, there's
like
a DoD light, and then there's sort of the DoD full, and the full one takes forever. We usually just run the light. As far as I know,
but it still takes a while.
Nobody's getting it back without like months of work, so it's just nobody's not going to try it.
Yeah, and even then, it's more than enough. Let's just reset this computer.
We use sort of the middle option, and it typically takes about an hour per machine based on about an 80 gig-ish hard drive.
Depends on the speed of the machines. We tend to hang on to our machines for quite a long time, so it tends to take about 4 hours a machine, but that's because they're, say, 8-year-old computers. We run a lot of Dells at work. I also have at home, we're all pretty much, girlfriend's laptop is Dell. I'm running a Dell on my laptop. So having the Dell diagnostic CD is pretty handy. Being able to run mem tests, so that's one of the most common problems. You have a bad stick of RAM in your laptop or desktop, and it causes all sorts of weird problems that are hard to troubleshoot. Instead of having to find a CD, or because I'm always misplacing things, I can just plug it into the network, boot from the network, and run a mem test without ever actually having to touch any physical media or download a disk image and burn it. I'm lazy, and then this is fast. So it's really handy in the office. It's all about time. So the boss wants me to spend as little time as possible doing my job. If I can automate something, they really, really like that. It takes me 5 minutes as opposed to 5 hours. Let's see what else. And one of the other things, you can take a snapshot over the network. So when the girlfriend's got a new hard drive, I took a snapshot of her existing hard drive, put the new one in, and then blasted the image across, so we didn't have to reinstall. She didn't have to set it up. Everything was exactly the way it was before.
Isn't there some kind of, is it Windows we're talking about?
She had Windows, but I'm running Linux, and it worked with either of them.
But doesn't Windows know when you put it on a new computer?
Well, no, she had the same computer, but what she did is she ran out of hard drive space. So she bought a new hard drive and said, hey, can you put everything on there, on here, and I don't want it to have to change anything.
Windows uses like 2 out of 5 factors. If you change more than that, it complains. Otherwise, it just says, "Oh, well, he's put a new processor in, or
And you can usually get away with changing, like, say, adding RAM and a hard drive, and that's fine. But if you change something like the motherboard, that's one change that'll freak it right out.
Yeah.
So they've got this whole system for how to detect if it's on a really new computer. Windows 7 actually works much, much better. In our office, we maintain probably a dozen different images for the, there's 200 computers, and we have, an image for each kind. So if there's a Dell 755, we have to have an image for it. We have a bunch of HPs, and each model gets its own image, because otherwise it's two different Windows. Windows XP doesn't like that. With 7, what we're finding is we can make 1 or 2 images. If it's just a Dell or an HP, and it doesn't really matter the model, it's better at not freaking out.
What about Linux? You have
Linux doesn't care.
images?
I mean, I can take my hard drive out of this laptop and put it in a desktop computer with entirely different architecture, and it boots up just fine. But that's...
Sorry, is this just OS, like say Core Plus apps, or is this just block? Like, is it just dropping just an image?
It's block level, so it understands the file system, but it's not...
But you can't do, like, you can't say do Windows XP and then, like, let's say you've got your call center, your admin, your communications people, and you have specific packages that go for each one of those people. But you've got your core stuff, which is like Windows and Office, blah, blah, blah. Now, can you grab your core and then choose those specific?
It has a concept called snap-ins, which basically it's directed at Windows. So you have your base image, and then you have, so like you say your Active Directory management console that your admins might have on their computers, but nobody else should have that. It can actually install that as part of blasting out an image. So you say this computer here, click these snap-ins, and it'll blast those packages, say Firefox or
like
Visual Studio.
CS5 for the communications people, or something like that you're not going to get the calls.
Now, some programs work better than others. I find most things made by Microsoft, anything that you can deploy through group policy works reasonably well through the snap-ins. If it doesn't work well through group policy, it doesn't tend to work as well. So it depends on how well the software itself was engineered, which is quite a wide variety. You can also add service packs and patches. So instead of having to re-image a machine every year to capture all the Microsoft patches, you just create snap-ins for each of these patches, and you just have them apply by default.
And you can push those too. Like, you could say, I want to pull out Firefox and I want to install Chrome. Can you do that as well, like for some of the sort of maintenance stuff?
We don't, but there's a helper program that you can actually pre-install on these computers, and you can do things like reboot it, add remove software, start and stop services. So it adds even more control than you normally would get through Active Directory and group policy. I don't mess with any of that. I just use it pretty much as a vanilla imaging, and then I have a couple of handy tools for if I need to get data off of a dead machine or a dying machine.
Have you ever used it with like an Intel-based Mac? Know of it working with?
If it can boot from PXE is the acronym. If
Yeah.
it can do that, it should be okay, as long as you have the drivers for whatever you're. So the underlying imaging is relying on Linux, so it may or may not work. I've never tested it with a Mac. Me and Apple are not talking anymore, so I messed with them for 20 years, and I will.
But it most likely would have to be an Intel-based.
That's all I've ever tested it with, so that's actually a good question. I have no idea. It never even occurred to me to look.
If you restore an image on a system that has a bigger hard drive, does it format the whole hard drive, or do you have to go back and re-increase the file size to the new size?
It depends on how you image it. There's a number of different modes, and it can do a dynamically resizable image, so that when you're blasting it up, you have a bigger hard drive, it'll just expand to fill the whole thing. That actually doesn't work with Windows 7, though. We're finding we had to use the older mode, which doesn't allow you to resize it at the time of imaging. So Windows 7 doesn't play nice with that yet. But
Well,
you can still,
once it's on the system.
once it's on the system, you can still use gparted,
Yeah.
any of the disk resizers
Windows
that
will
you use.
resize them. It's not easy.
Exactly. So,
I noticed you have,
and Windows 7 can do it live.
I noticed you have like Dell Diagnostics
Yeah.
system. Is that stuff that comes in there already, or is
So
that on?
the stuff that it comes with is memtest And then all this stuff here, the host registration. You can extend it. I've added these other ones. This is my development environment right here, so some of them actually don't even work, like the ERD commander. I've never been able to get it to boot over the network. But then again, I really almost never use it anymore.
Is it a big job to add other things in there?
It depends on what you're trying to add. So, like I found, I have a licensed copy of SpinRite. I almost never use it, but it's handy in very certain situations. I found it really easy to integrate, whereas that boot and nuke was actually a real pain, because they provide a bootable CD that doesn't boot well over the network. So I actually pulled an image out of another rescue disk. So that one took a little more monkeying to get working. But was always a Google search or two away, so it didn't seem to be.
How long would a re-imaging take with fog?
You're limited by your disk and network I/O. So if you have a 100 megabit switch, it's going to pin that switch and take as long as. So if you have an 80 gig hard drive, do the math. It's say 9.8 megabytes a second. How long will it take to blast?
What's the block level and stuff?
We do our drafting machines have 60 gig SSDs, and we can do an image in under 5 minutes on those over a gigabit Ethernet link. So,
Can you do it from a DVD? If you had your image on a DVD, bootable DVD, or do we?
you could. You're really limited then to the speed of the DVD drive, which is significantly slower than gigabit Ethernet is. It's probably even slower than 100 meg Ethernet. So possible. This is probably a bigger, more complicated solution if you're just going to do it off of the DVD anyway. There's another one called Clonezilla. You can actually make a bootable DVD and store an image on there, but then you're also limited to the 4.4 gig of a DVD drive.
Can you, is there any limitations as far as how many you can do at one time? Like I know using, EDD with Microsoft, if you're running it from a desktop or laptop, anything over about 6 to 10, and it would just block on, like it would just collapse.
It just gets slow. We actually run it off of an old Dell laptop at the office, so our imaging server is a laptop, so with a slow laptop drive, and then all the storage backs into. We have an NFS share somewhere else that it's a NAS appliance that has ridiculous amounts of storage. But what it does do is it has something called multicast. So a friend of mine runs a internet gaming cafe in town, and every time they do the Comic-Con, they take 12 machines and they set up a booth and they set up a little gaming center. And so what we do is we just blast it over multicast. So it's basically transmitting it once, and all 12 machines receive it and write simultaneously. So instead of having 12 individual streams, you're actually blasting one out in the network.
And it's a push, not a pull. Like it's pushing it out to them, it's not.
Yeah, well, multicast, what it does is it waits until you say, I want these 12 machines, it registers their MAC addresses in a web interface, and then you say, I want all these 12 to get a multicast image. So it'll hold off on sending it until all 12 have dialed in, said, hey, we're listening, send us the data, and they'll just wait, and once all 12 register, then it just blasts it out to all 12 at the same time. So you can do 12 machines on a single gigabit link with a slowish hard drive, because you're only actually sending one stream. But so just sort of broadcasting, and you have 12 computers writing it down.
Right. Like throwing a handful of scenes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Ghost has that multicast feature too, so that's pretty common in the industry. So that's the nutshell.